Good morning, everyone. So I am delighted to welcome you all today, both here in Brussels and online, for the annual Symposium of Real-World Evidence for Decisions on Policies and Partnerships. So today's meeting concludes this year's work and will give us a steer as to where we should focus our activities in the next years. Before I give the floor to Jo de Kock, let me first go over some housekeeping rules. So we want this meeting to be as interactive as possible. So this is where we encourage you all to take out your smartphones and scan the QR codes, which you can see on your screen, and join with the code hashtag RWE4Decisions. The Q&A chat on Slido is now officially open, so please type in any questions you have, and we can feed them back to our moderators and panelists throughout the day. There will also be opportunities for in-person participants to ask questions live later. So when you do so, please don't forget to mention your affiliation. The meeting is being recorded, and the recording will be available on the Real-World Evidence for Decisions website after the event. And after the coffee break, we will move into breakout rooms, and there will be 4 in-person breakout rooms and 1 online, which will be led by Karen Facey, who unfortunately could not be with us today, but she is with us online. Our online audience, if you would like to attend the virtual breakout, you will just need to raise your hand around 11 o'clock and we'll promote you. And you will then be able to open your microphone and camera and interact with Karen and other online participants. At the end of the breakout rooms, we'll then return back into this plenary format and then move on to our concluding remarks. A final word about social media. So you may want to share ideas, reactions, and interact on Twitter and LinkedIn. So you can do so by using the handle @RealWorldEvidenceForDecisions and hashtag policies partnerships, which is the topic for discussion for today. So now, without further ado, I'll give the floor to Jo.
Thanks, Marine, and good morning, everybody. A warm welcome also from my side and to you all, and thanks for being with us. We know that hybrid conferences are always challenging, and we will see in which way this experiment can be continued. But nevertheless, it's important that we have this annual symposium today to make also the status questions of real-world evidence for decisions related to policy and partnerships. Allow me to present briefly, or remember for many of you briefly, the origin and the aim of the project, the Real-World Evidence for Decisions initiative. The initiative was initiated by NIDI, better known as INAMI RISIF, the Belgian public authority dealing with pricing and reimbursement issues of medicinal products, in 2017. 5 years ago now. We were looking for ways to reduce uncertainties and to narrow the gaps between projected outcomes and clinical benefits. We wanted to strengthen the evidence base for decision making, and in order to better align value of the products and pricing of an increasing number of expensive and highly innovative and even disruptive therapies coming to the market. We wondered in which way the use of real-world data and real-world evidence could be helpful to respond to this concern, given the opportunities offered by the digital revolution. As a consequence, real-world evidence for decision was created and conceived as a payer-led multi-stakeholder network joining people from different backgrounds and different countries, public authorities, academia, patients, and industry. The network is based on 2 fundamental principles: collaboration and transparency. Collaboration, because we believe that real-world evidence generation is a shared responsibility between all stakeholders involved, which implies iterative dialogues throughout the life cycle of the technologies. Collaboration beyond silo walls and beyond national borders, even beyond the Atlantic. You have to know that we are also working together with our Canadian friends. The second and underpinning principle of the network is transparency with regard to the processes, data generation, exchange of information in order to create more trust. The network uses a learning by doing approach, by sharing experiences and discussing on concrete situations and case studies and even demonstration projects. Real-world evidence for decision is accompanied by a steering committee. You will see on the slide the list of experts who are coming from different backgrounds and who have steering and orienting our work. Many of them are present today to discuss with us the challenges and opportunities of real-world data and to look forward to our future. You see the list of our steering committee, and you see also that some of these people are joining us in personnel, and we are very grateful for that. But let's be clear, the network is not considering real-world evidence as a magic bullet or as a panacea, but as a complementary evidence base and tool, especially when classical methods cannot apply due, for instance, to the small number of patients involved or for other reasons, ethical reasons, for instance. The network emphasizes the necessity to use real-world evidence only when high standards and robust methodologies are in place. And in this regard, the Real-World Evidence for Decision Network has agreed on 4 topics, 4 pillars, which are for us pivotal for the development and the use of real-world evidence. They were recently published in the International Journal of Technology Assessment in Healthcare and showed, and the references are showed on this slide. And you see these 4 pillars. The pillars are data availability, governance, and quality. It's related to the quality of data and the availability of data, also related to the importance of data sharing. But we have to, of course, a good data governance should be in place also. Methodology, design, and analysis, trust, transparency, and reproducibility. We are working also together with Professor Schneeweiss, and policy and partnerships. As you can see, they address both policy related issues and issues related to the processes for individual HTA and decision making. These building blocks should be considered together as a whole. And underpinning the 4 main pillars, there's a need, of course, and that's also one of the missions of and the aims of this network, to invest appropriately in education and expertise. Today we will focus on policy and the partnership pillar. We cannot neglect that real-world evidence the last years has gained traction. The landscape is evolving. In the near future, we will have to deal with joint clinical assessments as part of the new HTA directive. How these assessments will take on board real-world evidence. And more, we are confronted with new therapies such as cell and gene therapies, ATMPs, often, but not always tackling rare diseases. How can payers be prepared to these challenges? Which role real-world evidence can play in the future in managed entry agreements? The aim of the Real-World Evidence for Decisions Network is not to reinvent the wheel, but to look for further cooperation and collaboration with others, and to make the best use of existing guidance to support good payer decision-making. We cannot neglect the important efforts which are made in the European Union. Therefore, we are glad we have 2 speakers and 2 keynote speakers today. And therefore, it seems to us from great importance to invite them, Mr. Rees and Mr. Kurtz, to address the symposium and to inform us about the initiatives with regard to the HTA regulation, the European Health Data Space, and the Darwin EU project. Afterwards, we have the occasion and we will reflect on the way we have already gone with the Real World for Decisions network, and it's our aim also to explore today our ambitions for the future. I wish you all a fruitful symposium. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Jo. So as you said, the landscape is evolving and there is new momentum to support the development and use of real-world evidence. You mentioned the HTA regulation, which is being implemented and with oncology and ATMP products, first in line to be assessed through joint clinical assessments in 2025, and often coming with uncertainties at time of launch. The importance of real-world evidence becomes increasingly clear. You mentioned also the EU regulation for European health data space as a good step forward. And hopefully it can provide the much needed infrastructure for the sharing of primary and secondary use of data and help address the sometimes fragmented approach across member states and make the system more interoperable. In this context, also Darwin EU is a great step in the right direction to enable collaboration between regulators, the EMA and HTA bodies and payers on the collection of data across the life cycle of a product. And we'll hear more about Darwin EU from Xavier Kortz in just a moment. But before that, we will hear from Andries Riesch, who has been involved in this initiative from the very start, and he will set the policy context. So unfortunately, he was traveling, so could not be with us this morning, but he has recorded his intervention for us.
Good morning, everybody. It's my pleasure to speak to you today. I'm very sorry I cannot join you, but the same day I have to travel, so I decided at least, give my short recording, how important is this initiative for me in the time of important decisions and development of the new systems and so on. So let me focus on the European health data space first. Why we develop this? It's clearly, data has really become the important factor in our decision-making process, from the way we are diagnose patients, how we decide our treatment options, and finally how we assess the results. So we decided to make sure that all important partners in this process can be involved. I mean, starting from the patients, of course, clinicians, HTA bodies, European Medicine Agencies, ECDC, which are having very privileged role in the system, but also industry, big and small, and the payers. So all will be able to have access to data. This is why important is to make sure that data are in the right quality, and data we are producing in healthcare system are used for R&D. This is very unique situation that often in our development we really decide our decisions on clinical data. So we have three pillars of this legislation: primary health data, those helping deciding about diagnosis and treatment of patients, consultation between healthcare providers if needed, and of course we make sure that the rights of patients are strengthened and clarified. The second important pillar of these regulations are secondary health data. Those we are using also for HTA and policy making and R&D and so on. And the third pillar is around the single market for digital products and telemedicine services, because we also see the unique opportunity in the current development of technologies. The second important point I would like to focus is about the regulation framework. We are 2 years before the finally HTA regulations will be fully implemented. It started already. Implementation with setting up the member states group and also work a number of guidelines and technical solutions, which we hope will be ready to go before the regulations will be finally in working. We should not forget we have implementation phase of the clinical trials regulation, very important regulations. It's in few months we can do clinical trials under new framework across EU. This is important also to make sure there's an interlink between the different regulations. And finally, medical devices regulation is also in implementation, including IVD, which again is important part of the regulatory framework. We are still working with a new framework for pharmaceutical products, but this one should be present in a few weeks by the Commission. Then about the lessons learned, because I think this meeting, this conference is about the try to really learn from each other. And I will mention a few developments. The Darwin EU colleague from EMA will explain more. It's a very important development in the area of real world data, big data, because here we decided to go ahead with the different pilots, which we will discuss today. And I think it's important this interlink between the different partners in this field, and of course data are critical here. And I hope since EMA is also joining European Health Data Space Data Pilot under the leadership of the French Health Data Hub, will be able also to learn how to not only gather evidence but also how to share evidence cross-border. The second important source of development is IMI projects. I just mentioned two of them, EDEN and H2O. Those projects are really giving us the new understanding also about the way data can be collected and used and so on. We have already experience in COVID era, which I think would be interesting also to study more also in the context of this initiative. Finally, international development, like through ICMA, just the cooperation of medicines agencies across the world. Here also we have interesting projects about the real world data and how they can be used. Just mentioned other international development, horizon scanning. It's also something that probably we'll discuss today as well. Let me finish with a great thank you to real world data for decision. This is the initiative. This is already going for some time. And I think we are reaching very interesting milestone now. So I wish you a very good day today and fruitful discussion. Thank you very much.
So, dear Xavier, the floor is now yours to give us an update on Darwin EU, what has been achieved already, how does the EMA generate real-world evidence, and perhaps you can tell us also a little bit more about the recent workshop that you held with HTA bodies and payers.
So I will give first an update on the progress of the Darwin EU work and the network. We have now completed phase 1, and we have the first list of data partners and of the studies to be conducted this year. And I will discuss the involvement of HTA bodies and payers. Okay, so just a reminder of what are the main areas for which real-world data analysis could support EMA scientific committees for decision-making, and this may also apply to HTA work. First of all, we have three main areas. The first one is to support the planning and validity of applicant studies. And there are two areas here. First of all, to facilitate the design and feasibility of planned studies by looking at the impact of the inclusion and exclusion criteria and what is the the impact on the feasibility of the trials and the selection of patients, and then to evaluate the representativeness and validity of completed studies by looking at the generalization and generalizability of the results. The second aspect is to understand the clinical context by providing information on disease epidemiology, incidence and prevalence of the disease. Then clinical management and looking at the standards of care and what is the standard treatments and therapies used for clinical diseases, and then on drug utilization, what are the uses of drugs and what are the different lines of therapies for a specific disease. And the third aspect is to investigate associations and the impact of decisions that have been made. We can do effectiveness and safety studies, but also looking at the effectiveness of risk minimization measures that are being implemented or decided. We have currently three main routes for doing these studies. We have the studies that we can do in-house. So we have in-house 6 primary healthcare database, and these are those licenses that we have, and we have large primary healthcare record from the UK, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, and Romania. So we can do these analysis very quickly in a matter of hours or days. We can do analysis in these databases, taking into account that they are limited in the context of the scope of the patient, because they are only referring to including patients from generally from GPs, general practitioners. But we are now having 2 additional database or hospital database from France, from 4 large French hospitals, but also from the UK. The second route is by contracting studies to universities or research organizations that we can have access to through framework contracts. We have framework contract with 8 research organizations, giving us access to 59 data sources from 21 EU countries. So together, but generally we do 1 study per with 1 framework contractor. And then we have the Darwin EU network that we are establishing now. So this is a federated network of data expertise and services to support the decision-making through the product life cycle. The main concept is that we received questions and from our scientific committees during the evaluation of outside procedures. We can develop study protocol, elaborate research questions that we provide to the Darwin EU Coordination Center that has been selected in February this year. This is Erasmus Medical Center, and the Erasmus Medical Center, the Coordination Center, then is onboarding a number of databases, and we plan to onboard 40 databases in 4 years. The principle is that these data sources are data sources that have been converted already into a common data model, and we have adopted the OMOP common data model, and the data stay local. So the principle is that the coordination center write the programming codes and the statistical codes, and then send these codes to the data sources that run just the codes, and then transfer the result to the coordination center for compilation. So this is a potentially very fast way of doing analysis, because there is only 1 programming code that is developed for a same study, and that can be run simultaneously in many databases and rather quickly. Of course, the condition is that all databases are converted into the same common data model. This is the implementation roadmap. So we have to keep in mind that we have started this year, and there are 2 years of establishment. So until next year, this is still the establishment phase, where we are developing the processes, the procedures, recruiting the first database, and starting the first studies as kind of pilot studies. And then from 2024, then the aim is to enter into the routine work with the possibility to do a large number of studies simultaneously. Now, the uncertainty is still the capacity of the Darwin EU network to run at the same time many studies. We will see that over time, but the aim is to be able to perform the objective 380 studies in 5 years. We have now onboarded the first 10 databases, which was planned for this year. So these are general practitioners database, but also hospital database from France, Spain, and I can't read from here, but other countries, but also from a biobank from Estonia, and a disease registry of cancer therapies from the Netherlands. So we try to have a rather broad selection of countries, but also of types of settings in order to be able to answer as many questions as possible. Well, just to go back to this, we are now reflecting and looking at the next set of data sources to be onboarded. And the question is what types of data source we would need. For example, disease registries. We have many candidates for being onboarded as disease registries. The question for us is what is the amount of resources or the share of resource we should allocate to specific disease registries, or the amount of resource that to be allocated to more transversal data source that cover the whole population. We have many requests for studies on specific disease, and that will require specific registries, but there are so many diseases that we can't cover them, of course. So this is a balance that we will need to be made, and that's probably will be important in the next years. This is in terms of studies, we have distinguished 4 types of studies that we can do in Darwin EU. First of all, the routine repeated analysis, which are based on the same protocol for a same product or same class of product that can be repeated over time. And I will give an example. This is, for example, for disease epidemiology, drug utilization. These are rather simple studies. Off-the-shelf studies are those that are using a protocol template that can be adapted to specific questions, like estimates of prevalence, incidence, and characteristics of diseases. Complex studies are more traditional, I would say, epidemiological studies, taking into account confounding factors and effect modifiers and so on. And then the very complex studies would be more exceptional, that they may require primary data collection or redefinition of codes and so on. This is the first set of studies that have been conducted now. The 3 first in green have started now. So they have started in November, and we expect the result in January. So this will demonstrate that through this system we can do very fast studies in order to answer questions from our committees. The first one is on population level epidemiology on rare blood cancers to answer questions from the orphan medicinal products. Then the second one on drug utilization study of valproate containing medicinal product, which has been an issue that has been a chronic has been a topic for several years now. And then the third one is a patient-level drug utilization study of antibiotics on the watch list of WHO to inform the antimicrobial resistance strategy. And we have a first 4th study that is being planned now on the cause of mortality in patients with severe asthma in patients aged more than 12 years of age. We are also thinking now about the studies for next year. And I told you about the routine repeated analysis. For example, what we plan is that the study on drug utilization of antibiotics, we will repeat it probably every year by doing it in other countries, changing the countries, changing the setting in hospitals or in general practice, so that we will be able to provide data over time of the utilization of antibiotics. We're also planning to start studies, routine repeated studies on use of opioids in countries. So, and I think this will show the power of this system of WNEU network. So where we can repeat and do the same study in large number of countries over time, with small cost, actually, because this is the same program that is going to be reused for each routine repeated analysis. Involvement of HTA bodies and payers. So we had a workshop on 6th of October, and these are some conclusions that are summarized on these slides. First of all, the HTA and payer representative highlighted and emphasized that there is a need for them to understand how WNEU will work in practical terms, what type of data are being onboarded, who can request real-world evidence studies, what kind of evidence will be provided, and how the evidence will be made available. What we plan is that we will see, as I said, in the next years, what will be the capacity of WNEU network, but we plan that it should be opened also to requests from other stakeholders, HTA bodies, payers, other EU agencies, possibly national competent authorities. So we do not aim at restricting its use by the scientific committees. We also had the comment that real-world data are important to HTA appraisals for effectiveness, safety, and utility, but there is a need to overcome the skepticism or reluctance of HTA with respect to use of real-world data for decision-making. I think this is the same comment as we have from regulatory agencies. The part of this skepticism is due to concern with the quality of real-world data, and this is why in the WNEU network, before onboarding a data source, there is a very thorough step of quality assessment, and has all the data source to be onboarded to have a same common data model. We run the same statistical assessment of the quality, of the amount of missing data, of the amount of data available for specific questions. So there is a very thorough assessment of the quality, and we have some assurance that the data source onboarded into WNEU have a sufficient level of quality. The question was whether the data that will be available are appropriate. For example, do they contain patient-reported outcomes? There was a discussion about disease registries, and this is a bit what I said earlier. They are important for decision-making by HTA bodies, but by ourselves too. And well, for regulatory authorities, we see now that the decisions and the evaluations by our main committee, CHMP, concerns more and more products that are used in specialized settings. And as mentioned, our database that we have from general practitioners, or they are useless actually for many of the questions that we have, because the products that are now authorized, most of them need to be used in hospitals or be prescribed and monitored by specialists. So disease registries will have a very important role to play. What we see is that there are still many of them, most of them are not ready to be used. And that's why we have published the guidance on registry-based studies, but there are issues perhaps of quality, but the most part of the problem and a large amount of the problem is due to the lack of governance, I think lack of readiness, lack of organization, perhaps lack of means. So there is still a lot of work to do. we are now funding a study on spinal muscular atrophy using the TREAT-NMD registry network, which really test and try to improve how to use registries for regulatory studies. And then there is an interesting question, is that we were told that, of course, the questions that can be addressed will depend on the type of data available. But what I say is that this is the inverse situation that should apply, is that actually we would like to know what are your research questions in order to help us recruit the appropriate data source. We have now onboarded 10 data sources and we still have 30 to onboard at least. So we would really like to have to know what are your priorities so that it can help us recruit the appropriate data source. And these are the suggested domain of interest that were expressed by HTA bodies and payers in the workshop. Natural history of disease and current standard of care, so this is the same as ours. Effects of new drugs, and again, importance of data collection in registries, and then effectiveness studies. And then there were a number of topics that were suggested in relation to the orphan medicine products, ATMPs, and rare cancer, and so on. We are continuing the discussion, and we have regular meetings and with you, Neta, and we really welcome all the discussions. My last slide is just this. We have published for public consultation, I think it is still open, a good practice guide that help, that provide recommendations for the use of a new metadata catalog of data source that we are building now, that will provide for large number of data source the characteristics and quality information that can help identify which ones are suitable for specific research questions and so how to use them. I think that's okay. So if you have any question, there is, I don't know if you have the slides, but there is this email address here that you can access and ask any question that you have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Xavier. Are there any questions? And I'm looking especially at our in-person audience.
Hi, Xavier. Simone Boselli from EuroOrdis. So, Rare Disease Europe. So, as you probably would imagine with your second to last slides, we will be very interested in the work that you're doing from now on. Particularly, I would like to have more information, if possible, on the study that you mentioned on SMA and the use of TREAT-NMD. For those in the room that don't know, TREAT-NMD is the network on neuromuscular disorder that preceded the European Reference Network. Now, this could be perhaps, if it is the first, but a model to use other disease registry. For example, in the bone, ERN bond, there are already 5 disease registry present. Could you elaborate on how the possibilities for integrating data are in these scenarios? Thank you.
You're referring to integrate data from SMA or from other registries, or?
For SMA, yes. The example that you're doing now on SMA
can
it be replicated?
Okay, yeah. The SMA study has been requested actually by the CAT, so the Committee of Advanced Therapies, not because for specific product, but because there are a number of products that are in the pipeline, of new innovative product, genetic products, and they feel that there is a lack of information on what are the standards of care, what are the natural outcomes of the disease, what is the incidence prevalence of specific outcomes. So this is really a characterization of the disease and of the treatment that are being used, the therapies and so on. So this is will be really a landscape analysis, I would say, of the study of the disease, and it will be used by the CAT for the evaluation, for the assessment of the clinical trials, the information, or at least the studies that will be submitted. And the cat is actually involved in the monitoring of the study too. So this is a very good example. And we are open to any other questions actually. Now, we as EMA, we will allocate the funding if there is a request from a scientific committee, or there is a good reason that is supported by a scientific committee. So, or this could be also if from the part of HTA bodies, if you have any questions, requests, we could certainly consider them. And we are actually, I would not say that we are waiting from them, but we have several meetings with, probably in the context of the Darwin EU Advisory Board, there is a representative of HTA bodies, and we have asked also for use cases where which we could use, and again, as I said, help us to select the appropriate data source to be included in the Darwin EU. And as I said, this is really the time now to do it because we still have 30 to on board. So there is certainly a lot of opportunities for Darwin EU, but also, as I said, we have the possibility to fund to fund studies through framework contractors, so that and probably the SMA studies done through TWEET and MD, but there are possibilities, certainly.
Thank you, Xavier. And we had one more questions from Dr. Matti Apro at the Genolier Cancer Center.
Thank you. Hello, Xavier. Very informative presentation. Thank you. One of the issues we clinicians have is the misuse of antibiotics, and I saw that you have something about that. But my question is, how are you capturing the data? You say patient-related data. Is that the fact that the patient have bought the antibiotic in the pharmacy, or how extensive is the data? Because patients buy it, but they might not use it, or they misuse it.
Yeah, no, this will be based mainly on prescription data from based on hospital data, but also on general practitioners' data on prescriptions, with information on the indication. That's what in the indication, because that's what's needed here.
Thank you very much, Xavier. So you will stay with us for a bit longer. So if there are any more questions that come in, either through Slido, we'll bring them in during the first panel. But just before that, we have one more presentation from Karen Facey to just give us a summary of the work this year. So over to you, Karen.
Good morning, everyone. It's my real pleasure to be able to present to you an overview of the work that we've undertaken in real-world evidence for decisions this year. As Yo said, we've been concentrating on 4 pillars to develop robust real-world evidence to inform pricing and reimbursement decisions, with a particular focus on data availability, quality and governance, and methodology design and analysis. And we've done this through reviewing the guidances which were identified in the paper, but also by taking account of policies that were emerging both nationally and across the EU, exploring case studies from different stakeholders, and lots of dialogue to generate learnings. I'm borrowing some slides from some of the presentations we had during the year, and I'd like to thank all those who participated in our roundtable meetings. But I am only naming a few people who made significant contributions to our work. So we started by looking at the guidances that were available in the systematic review undertaken by Kapkan and colleagues, and focusing in on those from HTA and related bodies. So, for example, we can see here that AHRQ in the US provide excellent guidance on how to use registries for comparative effectiveness research, and the IQWiG in Germany provide guidance on use of routine practice data for added benefit assessment. Since the paper was published, new guidance has been issued from HTA bodies like that from HAS in France, and NICE's real-world evidence framework was published just in June of this year. So HTA bodies continue to develop new work in this field. And indeed, just in the last couple of weeks, our Canadian colleagues at CADATH have published their consultation on their guidance for use of real-world evidence in decision-making. And I have to say, Canadians have been strongly involved in our learning network, and we're delighted that they've picked up Yoda Cox's phrase of learning by doing. Alongside looking at guidances, as I said, we've looked at policies, and obviously one of the most important policies is the European Health Data Space, as mentioned by Andre. We were delighted to have Jérôme de Barros come to speak to us before the EHDS proposal was published to explain what it was going to do in terms of primary and secondary use of health data. When the proposed legislation was published, we made a comment by ascertaining views of our real-world evidence for decisions community, and identified that we welcome the proposal, but there is a need to take account of the specific needs of HTA payers when considering secondary use issues. And to take this conversation forward, we engage with the Towards a European Health Data Space project, particularly with WP5, which are looking at governance issues. And they discuss with us the barriers that they'd identified for secondary use of health data. We worked with our community to identify the top issues for us, as shown in green here. And then we discussed the potential solutions and what might be seen as best for payers. And that was a very fruitful discussion. We also looked at what was happening nationally. And I think we all know that FinData is an exciting data infrastructure, and we're keen to see how that can be used by payers in Finland. We identified a number of initiatives that were ongoing nationally, and we engaged with our HTA experts to document that, and that's now available on our website, so you can see our summaries of national health data spaces. And we're delighted to announce that today we're launching those from Germany, Italy, and Netherlands. And again, we thank all those who filled in the forms that give a really nice overview of how such data can be used in pricing and reimbursement processes. We then moved on to look at case studies, to look at sort of real life examples. And we had a number of engagements with registry holders, particularly again in Canada. I'm thankful to Victoria Hodgkinson, who gave us a couple of examples of a neuromuscular disease registry, but also this global acromegaly registry, which is quite a new concept. So it's been designed as global from the outset. And I think the key message we took away here is that registries are not simple infrastructures. They're not just collecting data from one source, they're collecting data from many sources, including, as you can see here, from applications, from patient-reported outcomes, from a range of electronic health data sources, and from specific data collection. And we need to remember that complexity. From our industry colleagues, we had a presentation from Roche about the use of Flatiron oncology data for extrapolation purposes. And from Carlos Martin Saborido in Valtamed, we had a great update on the use of Valtamed, and they have clear transparency with all their protocols and interim reports presented on their website. Most recently, in our September webinar, we heard from Antje Bering about the new process in Germany for routine practice data collection, and how that the necessity for such routine practice data collection post the reimbursement decision is considered very carefully, and that a clear protocol and analysis is needed. So taking all that together, what were our learnings from different stakeholders? Well, firstly, from HTA bodies, everybody agreed at the outset that real-world data quality was the challenge, which is why we spent 2 roundtable meetings talking about it. And I think the overall conclusion was that we all need to recognize that routine practice data is never going to be of the same quality of a clinical trial, no matter how much monitoring we do of it. But we need to ensure that the data we collect is fit for purpose, that it's suitable for the research questions, for the clinical uncertainties that we're trying to address. We need to be aware that there will be missing data, put processes in place to manage that, but also we need analytical approaches to consider that as well. We then need to think about robustness of real world evidence. So we were impressed by the guidances that are already available that are consistent in the way in which they present the need for protocols, analysis plans, transparency, etc. But a recognition that each assessment is different, as each product has its own uncertainties and issues, and the trade-offs are therefore different about the validity of the real-world evidence versus the question to be answered and the context. We did also discuss that there's nothing explicitly in UNETA 21 work about real-world evidence. In terms of health technology developers, what they told us was that they want predictability. They are considering real-world evidence over the life cycle of a medicine, but they need to understand what real-world evidence will be acceptable, and particularly what real-world evidence might be transferable. So they are calling for agreement on when an RCT, randomized controlled trial, is not appropriate, or, for example, when an external comparator is acceptable. And perhaps we need to have some case study discussions to clearly document that. And again, demonstration that real-world evidence studies are incredibly complex, and so they would value a harmonized guideline or roadmap of existing guidelines so that there is a consistent assessment approach across EU member states. And from registry holders, what we heard was they're actually keen to engage with HTA bodies, but it's sometimes difficult for them to understand what HTA requirements are, given that what they're collecting is real-world data. It's not to the level of clinical research. And that to develop good quality data takes resources, and this needs to be funded. We need to minimize the burden on clinicians and help them to enter and clean data. But we had lots of discussions about how we incentivize them. And interestingly, particularly the Canadian registry holders told us how helpful the UNETA request tool was. Patients told us that we just need to be patient-centric in everything we do. They want optimized patient care, not only for themselves, but for others. And they don't want to see wheels being reinvented. They want collaboration to ensure quality and efficiency of approach. So the bottom line is we all see that there is a life cycle of real-world evidence generation over a technology's life cycle. And that goes not just from scientific consultation, but from horizon scanning right through to post-launch evidence generation, not just for pricing and reimbursement decisions, but for treatment optimization. So I'm sure that we will talk about some of these things later in the day, and I look forward to hearing the discussion. Thank you very much.
A very good morning. I'm Mathieu Apro. I'm a medical oncologist. I'm here representing the oncological doctors community. Impressive task, one for all the doctors that deal with cancer in Europe. But I do have a background of being the president of the European Cancer Organization, so I have some idea of what my colleagues would like me to say when it will be my moment to speak about this fantastic project. I'm here joined by several panelists, one online, and we will go without further ado to comments from them, and then to have a discussion with all of you, not only here in the room, but also there on the internet. So the first I have here on my list is Gazde Suzuz-Lebriggs. She's coordinator of Data Saves Lives, the European Patients Forum. And the question that we would like her to address is the fact that EPF, the European Patients Forum, has responded to the Commission consultation on the data space and the HTA. And what would she like to share with us about the patient perspective? We already heard something a couple of minutes ago, and what is the status of the Data Saves Lives initiative. So Gözde, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting today and having the voice of the patients as well in this panel. So as many of you may know, European Patients Forum is an umbrella organization representing chronic disease patients all around Europe. The European Health Data Space was very ambitious and timely initiative for EPF as well, and we welcomed it very gratefully, especially for the harnessing the power of the EU health data would definitely help deliver better care and ultimately improve patients' lives, but only if it's shaped and implemented properly with patients, not at the center only. I mean, because we do not want to say that patients are put in the center, but the topic of the patients are the center of the discussions, but also co-created with the patients. Because the success of European Health Data Space, we believe, lies in its ability to reach out to patients and citizens, to be shaped with them, to be accepted by them, and to respond to their needs. So EPF, of course, responded to the call, and as well, we're going to have our further statements that will follow next week, actually, about the more details about the European Health Data Space, especially about the secondary use of health data, you know, all the consents and some issues that we think from the beginning that needed to be part. One of the key aspects is actually education. We believe European Health Data Space needs to be also established with a parallel work that has to be around education, because if we would like to have a valuable, impactful involvement of patients and citizens in this process, they need to understand exactly what they are committing to and what they're talking about. And they can feel like within the table of discussions, they can voice themselves feeling empowered about the topics they're talking about. So in this aspect, what we are doing as EPF is an initiative called Data Saves Lives. We have been leading this initiative as a secretariat. It's a multi-stakeholder initiative for the last 4 years. And the main purpose of this initiative is to spread in our community, in our patients' community, importance of responsible health data sharing and concepts around health data topics. What are the challenges, but at the same time, what are the advantages? So we are really trying to be transparent. We have a multi-stakeholder community that is actually helping us build this structure together with our members. So we are very happy to announce this year, actually, we held our first bootcamp with 20 EPF member organizations that came together to learn about these concepts from our expert trainers. The topics were about European Health Data Space, the legislations, as well as GDPR. We covered also Health Data 101 topics, and also how to communicate about such an intense topic, actually with our communities, trying to make it as digestible, understandable for their own communities. So we did have a very successful, and we're very happy about the outcomes of the bootcamp, and we're hoping to continue next year, as well as our other advocacy and communications work around it. In that aspect, I would like to just finish by saying it's very important for us to involve patients for the European Health Data Space discussions, all the other initiatives that's being built around it, all the data collection initiatives and the big data initiatives going around, is if we would like patients to be contributing meaningfully to these discussions, they need to be more informed and more educated around the topic, so that we do not just invite them because they need to be there. It's because their inputs are also valuable and acceptable within the discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gözde, for these introductory words. I put down a couple of notes on what I'm going to summarize later. I hope that I will translate the key message that I understand from you. And the next one here at the table is Alexander Natz, Secretary General of the European Confederation of Pharmaceutical Entrepreneurs, EUCOP. The question is, of course, about the industry perspective. What are your expectations for the implementation of the HTA regulation and the European Health Data Space? Any concerns? What do you see as the opportunities when it comes to real-world evidence?
Thank you very much. Also, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here to speak about a very important topic from the industry perspective. So when we've been founding this initiative, I think 3 or 4 years ago, I don't recall exactly, there was no EU HTA, there was no Darwin, but there was, of course, there were post-authorization safety and efficacy studies. So we have been primarily talking about real-world evidence in the context of regulatory decision-making. We have partly been speaking also about HTA decision-making and the use of real-world evidence, but I think one of the achievements of this multi-stakeholder initiative is already that we are having a very robust and good discussion about what is the right methodology for real-world evidence decision-making in national HTA and also pricing and reimbursement decision processes. I think that's already one of the achievements of the initiative. And I think it's really very important that here we are talking about a multi-stakeholder initiative, because from the industry perspective, it is very important that we are at least trying to create a one-stop shop when it comes to real-world evidence decision-making and study designs and so on and so forth. Because at the end of the day, I would say especially smaller companies will have a difficulty in designing or adapting to 15 or 17 or whatever, even 10 different real-world evidence data requests from the national HTA institutions. We see real-world evidence is a very positive thing, and we are also very much open for discussions here in Brussels, and we think these discussions need to take place also in the context of the EU HTA. It is not really very prominent in the decision, or better to say, in the regulation of the institutions, but it's really important that we are looking at the potential of real-world evidence from various perspectives, from the patient perspective, from the payer perspective, from the industry perspective. And what are situations where real-world evidence can play a role? They can play a role when it comes to the first-in-class orphan medicine launched in European markets, where we might identify some data gaps, where we might not have all the data on the table at time of launch. And I think we as industry see it very positively if payers are willing to say yes to those type of medicines, and in a situation where industry is willing to commit to put certain data on the table later on, rather than saying no, why not using real-world evidence to close those data gaps later on. And we have to be upfront and clear enough to say and identify clear data gaps to say this is what we close and this is how we intend to close it in the next 3 or 4 years. Real-world evidence will play a critical role in that respect. We've heard also about SMA a couple of times during this morning. This is a situation where in a rare disease, we have by now 3 treatment options on the table, different mode of actions, 3 orphan drug designations, different products, right? So this is where payers want to see direct comparisons. And again, rather than saying no, because there's no direct comparison, payers, in our opinion, should really be open for industry to put real-world evidence data to the table later on. This is what we're doing. There are a lot of national registries when it comes to SMA. Smart Care is one of them. There is an obligation from GBA, and I think we also talked with Antje Behring in our session about this SMA registry in Germany, where the GBA pretty much top-down approach is asking for additional data to be put on the table in a national context. And of course, we also heard here today that in SMA, there is an idea to have a European registry. And this is really the direction of travel we should all take together, to have a European registry in an ideal scenario, which meets the demands of the payers, which meets the demand of the patients, and also the demands of the physicians to know what product is best for which patient. I think this is really very important. And I think it's a very good example, rather than having 5 or 10 different registries at the national level. And I'm not criticizing those registries, not to be misunderstood, but rather to go European, rather to have one registry, which is, to be perfectly honest, from the industry, a very important ask and point we are making here. And last but not least, we've also talked about this. Real-world evidence is also used, and there are concrete examples in so-called pay-for-performance models, outcome-based agreements. One example is, and the product hasn't been successful in Europe, but still it is an example, is Integlo in Germany, where I think it was PASS data, which was mandated from the European Medicines Agency for regulatory purposes, where this data was reused, and this is what we are discussing in the European health data space. how can we use real-world evidence data. This data was reused in this setting of a pay-for-performance model, which at the end of the day has not been successful because the company pulled out the European markets. But it's a very good example how to reuse data. So to close up, we are very grateful for the initiative. We think that it is actually the only example where we have a good discussion about how registries could be set up at the European level. It's a right point in time to discuss that because the EU HTA methodology is in the making. And also, I would want to make the point here that when we talk about real-world evidence decision-making in HTA and payer decisions, there needs to be a very robust methodology behind this. I think Antje Behring, for example, made that very clear. We have to put out a question. We have to define the data gaps. And then we need to discuss together what is feasible in closing those data gaps. This is what it's all about. So I don't think real-world evidence will substitute RCTs, but I think it will have a very important role to play in the future in decision-making for better informed decisions for all stakeholders involved. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alexander. And now we move to Claudia Furtado. She's the head of the Health Technology Assessment, Pricing and Reimbursement Division of the Portuguese Authority of Medicines and Health Products, Infarmed. So Infarmed is both an HTA body and a payer. And Portugal played a very important role when, during the EU presidency, it allowed for the HTA regulation to get really started. So where are we in the setting of UNET HTA 21?
Morning, everyone. Thank you for the invitation. Infarmed is not only a HTA and payer organization, but also a regulatory one. So we have the full life cycle of the medicine. I'm happy to be here because we are in a moment that not only several HTA initiatives are in place, but also in relation with health data initiatives like European Health Data Space and Darwin EU project. And I think these kind of discussions are important because we need from the beginning, at least this time, start to create the synergies to avoid duplication and make the process more efficient to permit the access to questions. Oh, sorry. But I also wanted to be clear that from the HTA and payers perspective, the real-world evidence is not, as Joe already mentioned, a panacea for all the constraints that we actually have in evaluating the added value of a medicine. So it will be important in some cases, but it's not a substitute for the sometimes limited data that we have at the moment of assessment. And it is not also the element that will address high cost of medicine. So I think we, at least for our HTA and payers perspective, it will have an important role in some specific cases in complementing the data from randomized clinical trials and also to support outcome-based agreements, especially in cases of medicines with high clinical uncertainty. Considering this role and also to decrease the clinical uncertainty that we are aiming to address, we need to have data that is fit for purpose, and Karen already mentioned that. And we also have to have robust and adequate methodologies that can be recognized as valid from the HTA assessment bodies. And I think these are the main challenges, and these are at least some challenges that have been addressed by real-world evidence for decisions. But I think we also have some opportunities, and they were mentioned today. We have the European Health Data Space. We have the Darwin EU project that also has HTA and payers in its advisory board. Infarmed is there, but more on the regulatory perspective, but still part of the Darwin EU project. We have these initiatives may have different purposes, but they have points in common, and we have to develop further these points in common and work in a collaborative way, because we will not have the resources to do all the same pathway. So if there is, sorry, if there is already a pathway that is being, how do you say, pursued, you should engage with other entities. And in relation with the HTA regulation and the UNETA 21, we must recognize that real-world evidence is not a major part of it. We have 4 pillars in the HTA regulation: is methodology, joint clinical assessment, joint scientific consultations, and emerging technology. We could not address all the points that are needed, but we have to prioritize, and these were the ones that were identified as the most important to be in the HTA regulation. However, there is space for this real-world evidence collaboration under the voluntary cooperation. That is a space that is foreseen in the HTA regulation where this collaboration can be pursued. We think that even if it's not one of the main pillars of the HTA regulation, there is no doubt that we have to collaborate at the European level with European Medicine Agency to identify in a timely way the new medicines that are going to have a evidence generation plan. We need to collaborate between HTA agencies and EMA and of course the company in this evidence generation plan. That can be also done in joint scientific consultations. It's not the main aim of the joint scientific consultation, but it can be addressed also there in some way. And we need to be sure that what we need, and the question that we are asking is addressed from an early phase, because it's not in the moment that we approve the medicine for reimbursement that we are going to start creating this evidence generation plan. It has to be done a long time before. Otherwise, we won't have the data to fill the gaps that we need. And for the moment, it's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claudia. And now we move to Robert Sauermann. He's the Deputy Head of Department of Pharmaceutical Affairs, Association of the Austrian Social Insurance, and Chair of the Medicine Evaluation Committee, MEDEV. Question is, what is realistic? What is feasible from the insurer's point of view? And will the EU initiatives on the health sickness funds to use real-world data optimize the use of medicines? Yes, no. What's your perspective?
Thank you. So we, as a payer, we are working every day with drugs that have to be reimbursed, with medical assessments, with economic assessments, and we are facing the gaps and the challenges. And we work already with data in every country, and there we see the chances and also some hurdles. And what we do at MEDEV, which you mentioned, is that we gather and we share our experiences across Europe. And by discussing such cases, we see some problems, we identify some chances, and we also try to communicate this to the stakeholders, to this initiative, or to Darwin, or to the EU Commission. And I think we try to be a constructive partner in this. And I see the chances are clear. If we can analyze health data, we have to keep in mind we must not only think about disrupting orphan therapies or something with one-arm trials. It's much broader. We are also talking about very mass indications, obesity. What happens with treatment to this? What do we achieve where we invest our resources? Do we achieve the best of the patient in all these diseases? So it's a broad spectrum of diseases. And well, if you may say, on the top, that would be the king discipline would be a real a precision reimbursement, pay for performance, which might be the case in some special cases, but it will not be the mass of the products. It's not possible to make a scientific project out of every reimbursement. It would not be feasible. So we have to develop really truly learning healthcare systems and to watch our activity and to monitor our activities. And to do so, I think these European initiatives can be good motors, because we're struggling at national levels with resources and with everything. And as in other fields, if there comes a European initiative, so everybody has to be on board and has to adopt. But we also want to tell our concerns. Well, it has been mentioned several times now that the evidence requirements might be lowered. So, and it's not helpful to get a therapy more rapid to the market if then there is no information available to make a decision, and then which leads to a delay in patient access in the end. Also, if we talk about responsibilities, and if this is about data exchange between different stakeholders, we have to define it as responsibilities, for instance, for companies to bring the products also to the markets in every EU country, which is currently not the case. And so who has to work, who has the benefit? I think data, it's to have good data, it's a lot of work, a lot of resources. I think we have to take care of data protection. I mean, it should be, but it must be mentioned. And well, these are some of the issues that we see.
Thank you very much, Robert. So, on the plan here, I'm said that I have to conclude. And complementing with my perspective, i.e. the clinician's perspective on what I have heard. So I think that we had interventions that highlighted various perspectives about the question of real-world evidence. And to go in the order of presentations, I think to me, the key message that I heard from the patient perspective is the necessity of co-creation. Don't call the patients just because they have to be there, because it's the latest fad. You have to have a patient in the board, but really co-create, ask the right patients, the educated patients. I think that was very clear. And then we have done progress. This was very clear. A few years ago, we didn't have this new HTA, I would call it harmonization initiative. We didn't have Darwin. Of course, nothing's perfect, and this is my perspective, but I know that we are aiming for this perfection. And then there are different areas and different disease issues, common diseases, rare diseases. This was mentioned several times. We cannot use the same perspective in every setting. I heard one point that we might want to take up for next year, which is this question of pay for performance. What do we do with that? In oncology, we have had this experience in several settings in the past. And they allowed to have early access to drugs where you weren't quite certain whether yes, no. And that was very helpful for the patients and, of course, for the oncologists. And then the key point here is it's wonderful that so many of us are here together, because the call from everyone has been that we have to work together, we have to share our understanding, our knowledge, the initiatives, understand who is doing what, so that we can go forward. And my final word is that we should never forget that health technology assessment is not only about drugs. In oncology, for example, patients are cured from cancer thanks to surgery and radiation oncology, and there are huge questions in there that need to be addressed. And my final point, for those of you who know me, know that one of my areas of interest is elderly patients, and this is an area in which we clearly need real-world evidence because they are not in the studies for zillions of reasons, good and bad. They are excluded from the studies, and we clinicians are struggling to know what is the best way to go. And I know that there are initiatives at the EMA level, for example, for that. So this is my summary for all of this. I hope I didn't distort anyone's perspective, but I gave mine. So Xavier is also here with us in the room, and you are more than welcome because maybe there will be a question. And now I'm going to ask Marine to let us know what is coming out through Slido.
Yes, thank you very much, Matti. So indeed, we are opening up the floor for questions. We have one for Xavier, but maybe just beforehand, there's one on this pay-for-performance model. And the question is it possible to explain how real-world data can be used in practice by the payer? So maybe we start with that one, and then we go to Xavier. So I don't know if Alexander or Robert...
I can kick it off on the last one. I made a concrete example, and this is in the public domain, that in that case of Zynteglo, where the company has offered a pay-for-performance model, not just in Germany, but also to other payers in other countries. And I don't want to talk about the product and the specific situation, but there was a very clear pay-for-performance model, which had the endpoint of transfusion independence. And there was at the same time, a point in time, a registry from EMA where data was generated, which could be answering that question. Is there transfusion independence? As a patient going back even after the gene therapy has been applied to transfusions? And that data was reused in that pay-for-performance model between the payers and the company in Germany, at least. I don't know about the other countries. It's a very concrete example of reuse of data. But I would also wanted to say that I see equally, if not more, potential of the use of real-world evidence also outside of performance models, because what you said before, I totally agree with that. There are other means to use real-world evidence also in bigger patient populations. It's a very wide concept with very different usages. It's not just P4P, but it's a very concrete example that EMA data can be reused in the setting in the measuring of performance in a P4P model.
Thank you very much, Alexander. And I think Robert, you also wanted to react.
Yeah. Well, it can pay for performance can be from very simple to very complex. So we have tried, and I think I can say that from a payer's view, the experience is very mixed, to be polite. If a simple one would be if you have an oncology drug and the patient withdraws therapy after 3 months, which is 3 packages, then you can say he's a therapeutic failure, and the package 1, 2, and 3 are paid by the company. And if he continues therapy, that's an indicator of that the therapy is successful. Otherwise, it wouldn't be continued. So there is a response. So it would be a very simple thought. I think things like this can be done. If it comes to more complex, specific lab data, we tried this in Austria, and we had the problem that the data was not complete, and the company wanted a very small window of the day within which the lab has to be done, which was not realistic, and these things, and it can go up to neurological scores. What do we do with missing data? And so who trusts in the data, or if there are deviations, or even if it's known that they are used for reimbursement, could this affect the physician who gives the score because he's an employee of the hospital, and so on. So there's a lot of question about this, and that's why we are open, but also very careful with this topic. Keep it simple. And another thing is the willingness to engage in this. So we also sometimes our experience is to ask companies, but well, you say this drug is the greatest thing in the world. If it's that great, then we should be able to measure that. are you willing that we couple the payment to the, and then there comes a withdrawal. So it really needs a willingness, a change in mindset from all sides.
Thank you. And so there is also a question related, but linked to Darwin. So Xavier, this one is for you. Is there a name for Darwin to support HTA agencies and payers with post-launch real-world data for HTA reassessments or managed entry agreements?
Yes, we are certainly open to have Darwin EU being used by other stakeholders than our committees. And as I said, we are actually open for a use case to be introduced for next year and to be tested, pilot tested next year. Just keeping in mind that we are still in the establishment phase of Darwin EU and we are still testing the capacity and the ability. I would like also to say that and to emphasize that Darwin EU will not be able to answer all questions. And there was the example of the use of antibiotics by patients. That's why actually in the context of the EHDS2 pilot, which was mentioned by Andreas Ruiz, there is a use case, a pilot case that is has been proposed by EMA and selected by the commissions. And but the topic is on coagulopathy. But the importance is that the objective is to test how Darwin EU can be integrated in a wider network for a same research question. So this use case will test how the data coming from Darwin EU can be integrated and combined with data coming from other public health authorities. And so there will be Darwin EU, and there will be also public health agencies from Croatia, Denmark, Finland, France, and perhaps Germany that will be included. Therefore, the final objective is to test and to look how to integrate Darwin EU with other database from that are not included. And Darwin EU cannot stay separated from the other source of data that exist.
Thank you very much. We have one final question, but we'll keep it brief. Maybe that's a good one for you, Claudia. So someone said ATMPs might not be feasible to be assessed via joint clinical assessments using classical HTA methodology based on RCTs, so randomized control trials. What will European HTA bodies do about it real-world evidence methodology-wise?
It's not an easy one. I think this is a work in progress. We are also developing the methodologies and mentioning the UNETA 21. That is the main aim of the UNETA 21, to create and discuss, and some of them are in public consultations, the methodologies that will support these assessments. Of course, when we are dealing with HCMPs, the evidence is scarce, and we have to recognize that and deal. Probably that's why I mentioned that even probably in joint scientific consultations for those medicines, there will be a need to an early dialogue with the evidence generation plans, because otherwise it won't be feasible to provide access to those medicines. Like Robert was saying, sometimes we have early assessments by the European medicine agencies, and then we have constraints in the HTA assessment because there is a lack of evidence. In this particular case, it's probably is going to happen. So we have to be prepared to deal with that in a timely way. Otherwise, it will be what is happening now, that we are having a sequential evaluation and with sometimes delays in the assessment phase that should have been addressed previously. So I think even if it's not in joint scientific consultations, in the voluntary cooperation, there will be certainly a space for this collection of data. Just only to mention, for instance, for spinal muscular atrophy, that was an example that we already mentioned here. We developed in Portugal not only a registry, but to deal with this uncertainty, a performance-based agreement, where besides the negotiation on the price, that negotiated price will be only paid if some results were developed. So, but this is not efficient to do at a national level. We should do this at a European level and discuss the endpoints that should be measured in a collaborative way. So that's so that we can have these steps with HTA regulation. It will not happen everything in 2025. It will be a sequential work, and probably at the end we will reach the same aims. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So thank you very much, Matti, and to our panelists. So I think there's a lot of food for thought also in terms of what topics need more discussion also in real world evidence for decisions 2023. And we'll come back to that. I hope you can stay with us for the rest of the program. So just before we go into for a coffee break, a quick reminder of the next steps in the program. So when we come back in 20 minutes, we'll be split up in different breakout rooms. So for our online attendees, there are 4 different breakout rooms. 2 in this one, so the one with Simone and Diane Klenemans will be here, and then room 3 and 4 with Carlos and Toon will be in the coffee area. For online attendees, there's also an option to discuss a more specific topic. So now is the time where you can raise your virtual hands to show your interest in joining that breakout room that will be led by Karen. Yes, so please do so now and enjoy your coffee break. And we come back here in 20 minutes. Thank you very much.
Welcome back, everyone. So hi, my name is Pia Rannanheimo, and I come from the Finnish Medicines Agency, where I work as a chief specialist with, for example, data and European health data space related things. It's my pleasure to introduce you to our members of the steering group who are now summarizing these breakout room discussions for us using 3 to 4 minutes each, and then finally discussing the way forward with this initiative. So we have first Diane from Inamiritziv, then Carlos there from Spanish Ministry of Health, Simon from the Eurodis, Rare Disease Europe, and Toon from Takeda. So you all facilitated one of the breakout sessions. So let's go one by one, room by room. What was the summary of the discussion? So Simone. The question for you was, how can patients and patient groups support the generation of real-world evidence for HTA purposes? So tell us.
Thank you very much. It was a great discussion. You can have a summary if you have a time, about an hour to decipher my calligraphy on 2 pages over there. But very much we started, and we're very lucky to have a very strong Belgian patient representative in the room, and we would like to outline 5 points. 1, patients are experts. They're not. It's been established for a number of years, but particularly in rare diseases, people that live with a rare disease are real experts in their own disease, but also they manage to co-create and not only treatments, but also care pathways with definition. The relationship is very strong between the rare disease community and the physician and the researcher, if I wish, and even sponsors for treatment. Therefore, the patient expertise should be used much more importantly in evidence generation planning, to build up the knowledge of the patient community on how treatments are developed, if they are used in different ways through, for example, compassionate use or either type of early access programs, etc., etc. Secondly, still focusing on the patients, the co-creation of evidence that matters to patients is happening, particularly in some areas where both patient organization and their physician develop quality of life treatment that capture essentially what really makes a better life for them. That is particularly meaningful, and that can also be relevant for HTA and pricing and reimbursement area. One other point related to patients is their early involvement in the evidence generation planning. But here I would like to stress that the early dialogue, parallel assessments and scientific advice that we have, so the procedures that are in place for the regulatory aspect, are not often used to their best outcome. For example, we all know, and is found in the literature, the scientific advice makes the consistent use of scientific advice with patient expertise and input makes for more successful clinical development programs. Therefore, making sure that those procedures are used, perhaps even making mandatory in some areas or some disease area to improve the development of the therapies, but also to improve the evidence generation planning with the involvement of HTA and payers. And the last 2 points are on data. Specifically, one point that I quote Stefan here is for the having some data that are fit for purpose. What we have here, we need to have a shift from database registry to query-based registries, because in the system that we currently have, or that we had so far, most of the databases are only based on the collection of data, but they're not necessarily based or built to respond queries from others. So the interoperability and making sure that all of the registries that are taking place, whether these are European or national, they can talk to each other, they're based on the FAIR principle, and then can be used well. And finally, it's important to talk and educate also patients and inform them about the data usage, to build trust in the system, to build trust on how those data can be used, and to make sure that the clear safeguards are in place, so that this trust can percolate through into the overall system. And that's it.
Great. So 5 points. I think one of my takeaways from this would be that patients and their expertise should be included early on, early as possible.
As early as possible.
And what the final point, I think, reminded me of the Finnish sort of key principle in secondary use of data, that data should be entered in the systems once and then used for multiple purposes. So the query point, perhaps there. Yeah, great. Thank you so much. So Diane, your group, the question was, how can we get timely and robust real-world evidence that can be used for reimbursement decisions?
Okay, we have interesting and vivid discussion with a lot of topics that were discussed. I want to thank Alina for taking note. But the first point that was identified was that at present there is quite a huge discrepancy between the need for marketing authorization on the one hand and the need of HTA and payer. And so if we want to improve the system and get we need to put in place a dialogue as early as possible between the various stakeholders. And when we say various stakeholders, it's not only the industry on the one hand and the authority on the other hand, but also the healthcare provider and the patient. It should probably be at the time as the result of an horizon scanning that help us to identify for which product we need to do that and identify what are the gaps. And based on that, what are the gaps? How can we fill these gaps? So what are the questions? What will be the source to answer to the gap on the one hand? And what will be the timeline to answer to it? We also emphasize that it is important when we ask this question yes, we do a difference. We identify at that time what can be answered by real world data on the one hand, and what cannot be answered by real world data, and by which mean it will be answered in that case. What is also important for us with regard to real world data is that the questions are simple, so that it's clear, and it should be a one entry system, a single entry system. So we come together with the comment that you made. It is important that it's a dialogue that involves all the people, that there is a trust, a flexibility amongst the people. That's very important. One question that also come on the table was that we have to use what is already existing. We don't want to reinvent the wheel. There is already a lot of platform and system at the European level and at the national level. So we should make use of that. But there is also a sort of system that allows us to talk together, and that these platforms talk together. That's very important, so that we have a single entry system. One of the big questions that came was, how shall we fund that, and who will fund it? That's a key question, I think. Did I forget something, please? Yeah.
So looks good. Takeaways from this, I think start early, the same with multiple stakeholders dialogue, and keep it simple. That was in the first panel, I think, also, and then like use existing infrastructure.
Yeah, there was also some underlying of the need for quality data that should be defined, transparency, and also a life cycle approach of the different products, and also of the disease. One of the comment that was also made is that certainly for orphan disease, in certain case, we don't have a good knowledge of the normal course of the disease, and real world data can help us to have a more robust information with regard to the normal course of the disease, and then can compare it to the effect of the drug, the technology which are coming to the market, which is an important element to take decision for reimbursement.
Yes, contextualization. Yes. So I think I move to Carlos now. So you thought about with your team, how can we work in partnership to support real-world evidence generation post-HTA?
Yeah, well, the discussion had been very attractive, I could say. We have moved from HTA payers, and because when we talk about the post-HTA, could be between HTA, payer, after payer. So we have discussed this topic. So we have described where we think we are, and we have identified 4 areas. So the first one is we are using real world evidence very reactively, not proactively. So this is one area we have identified. We develop real world evidence protocols just when we need it. We need for reimbursement, we need for HTA, and this is something we can improve. The second one is very similar. We're using real world evidence, not systematically, only ad hoc. So this is something we think we are doing currently. So also we are using real world evidence in pharmacovigilance, and we are underusing this data. This is another idea. And also we are not consistent through not only national, but also international about the concept of real-world evidence. So then we have designed our ideal future. So the first thing we would like to see in the future is the data-precise use of real-world evidence in different situations. So not real-world evidence in general, but focusing on different drugs or different situations. The second one is very similar to my precedent colleagues, but we have said instead of early dialogue, very early dialogue. So we went just to the inception.
That's what we mean.
And that's linked with the real world evidence access by private and public collaboration in order to design RCTs. So this is something quite strange, but we have been discussing that if we have real world evidence available, we probably need to share in order to design good clinical trials. So that's why we think it's very early. Also, we mentioned the life cycle of the drug, like a continuous between regulatory and going through HTA and ending in the payer. And the third part of our discussion is how to do it. And we mentioned we need an evidence generation plan, but not for every drug. We need to prioritize when we need an evidence generation plan. Also, the evidence generation plan needs to be planned with all stakeholders and in a very early moment. Also, we stress the need of pharmacovigilance, real-world evidence data to reassess in HTA and payer framework. Also, the last two ideas were doing an integrated approach for everything. So we need to put all data integrated in a good sense. And the last idea was we need a strong legislation, not just drafts and papers, but a strong legislation at European level.
Thank you. That was great. I think you came from the current state to the sort of ideal state, and then had a concrete success things that we could do, evidence generation plans that would include not only payers and companies, but all important stakeholders. So I think that's a good bridge to tune. Then you or our group discussed partnership for real-world evidence generation. What are the roles and responsibilities for each stakeholder?
Thank you, Pia. And we had the benefit of having the moderator of this panel part of our group, so this should help in bringing it together. I think we had to start, our question indeed was roles and responsibilities of all these stakeholders. We had the benefit of having all stakeholders around the table. I think that was a good start. We looked at, and we tried to make it actionable in terms of where do we go from here, in terms of that future state, Pia, that you were talking about. And where do we go from here? We've been looking at the 4 pillars of the work that we have been doing so far, and then applying the principle of collaboration and transparency. And then I'm just going to go through some of the concrete stakeholder views, and then of the next steps recommended by the different stakeholders. We started looking at federated systems like Darwin, and we heard this morning more about that, and what is needed to make that working. I think there was an interesting first question from the HTA perspective. Pia, that was you, but I think it was a very important question. It was around governance in that system. It's very clear on the regulatory side who ask these research questions. Is it COMP? Is it CAT? Who asks these questions? I think Xavier was very clear, but it's not so clear on the HTA side. Like, who asks a research question to Darwin from the HTA side? How does that work? What's the governance around it? Who plays a role there? So I think if we translate that into an action from this group, it's like, can we come maybe with some recommendations on the governance that from this group that we can submit to EMA on the workability of that system. So that was the first perspective on the HTA side. Then the second perspective was from the clinician side, was about research questions. We need to have clarity on these research questions, because if we invest, and I think that was very clear, the primary task of the clinician is obviously taking care of his patient. So, but if we invest time in data collection, it needs to be crystal clear why this question is asked and what is it that we need to collect to come to good quality of data. So it's not just, I think if we translate again to the work of this group, it's not just getting kind of that guidance on and clarity on research questions. It's also the question about the day-to-day kind of how do we get a data manager in place to collect some of that data. So these were some of the real questions asked from the clinician perspective. And then last but not least, from the patient side, there was clear willingness to share data, strong emphasis on co-creation of what comes out of that in terms of registries, what have you. But I think we had a good discussion on also pay for performance models and how patient groups can be involved in that, but also for the evidence collections, again, translating that to the work of this group, can we, and we had an example from one country where patients were not so much involved in these discussions, can we maybe do from the work of this group a collection of user cases of some of these models from other countries, where they work, how they work, and whether they are effective to inspire each other. So those were some concrete asks from the group and inputs, I think, which are very valuable for the future work of this initiative.
Thank you so much. So I think at least 3 points: governance, clarity on research questions, and motivation for the data entry, and then patient involvement in practice and collection of use cases, sort of to learn from others. Great, thank you. There was an online panel also, and we thought that there have been notes taken there, so we don't ask from the online audience now, but their discussions will definitely feed into the Secretariat's work. So thank you for the online audience also. Now time for questions and answers. And I thought perhaps we could first start with Matti, and could you please reflect to the first panel, talking about all these 2 important data initiatives ongoing now. So having heard this discussion now, what do you think?
Well, thank you, Pia. And don't you all in the room believe that this is a Finnish-led meeting, even though it happens that I was chairing the first one and Pia is chairing this one. It's all of us working together. I think that from the first discussions that we had earlier, what I got, which was a little bit alluded to here, and I would like to hear a little bit more about this idea, is that we need to really work together. We alluded to the fact that there is no mechanism by which the HTA or European or the national authorities could actually ask Darwin to do something. That mechanism doesn't exist, and there's probably not a good mechanism for exchange of information between the different stakeholders. And this is something that I felt from the first panel, which I personally would like to hear now from the panelists here.
Thank you. Any reflections, panel?
If I may, my interpretation of what, for example, Xavier is still here. No, he's not. He's gone. But what it was suggesting, way that the pilots are being done, and particularly for our interest, what is being done in the connection of the registry on SMA and treat and through the network that is dealt with by Treat and MD. It's really promising, because I believe that if we see what is in the pipeline and what also matching the registries that are available in terms of both the natural progression of the disease, but also the uses of treatment and care built into the European reference network, we have huge possibility to have better evidence and making more informed decision. I'm not sure if we need to be bogged down into the question how can we ask Darwin if there is? I think it should ask. I think it's, and if I did hear correctly, it seems that EMA has some resources available to create those data. So I think there is a real opportunity there to make things happening. And given the what's going to be next, and given that rare diseases are and orphan drugs are really on top of mind, I think we need to make it work, because in those areas, the use of real world evidence to reduce the level of risk and uncertainties at time of marketing authorization, whether conditional or full, is of real importance.
So test Darwin.
Yeah, test Darwin.
Don't be afraid. And then like share good experiences, but also I think the do not do's, like there's a lot of those also. So it's important to learn from those also. But any other questions, comments from the audience or from Slido?
I see a question in the audience. Yes, there's a man behind you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. So are you aware of any countries right now where there is an example going on of an HTA implementation where they already are thinking about including the EHDAs?
From the Finnish perspective, we are sort of writing a report now where we also look the data generation for managed entry purposes, and we are definitely like describing 2 different types of processes for the future vision. The one of them is built on the European Health Data Space / FinData model. The other one would be more like Darwin and federated analysis using OMOP. So it's sort of a paper thing now, but we are thinking about it. How about you?
Yeah, maybe just to add to that, obviously from an industry perspective, we are very concerned for the moment where this is going, UHTA, in terms of, because a lot of the devil will be in the detail there. And I think there's a lot that still needs to be discussed indeed about in terms of the governance and the methodologies that will be used, and to stay true to the real objective of the regulation, which was to actually harmonize and kind of simplify HTA assessments across Europe. And what we see right now is that there is a tendency that this may and being an additional layer at European level that is not picked up at the national level. And that's for sure where your question is coming from. And I think a lot needs to be done there, that the joint clinical assessments are being picked up at national level and used for the purpose that they have been set up for. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done there. I think also maybe more in the context of this group, there's still a lot that we could be doing there as well, because I think real-world evidence, as indicated, was an area that's not so clearly covered as part of the remit. But I think there as well, in terms of the methodology, more guidance on the use of real-world evidence as part of health technology assessment is also, I think, a space where this multi-stakeholder collaboration can give input to make sure that the regulation meets its objectives.
My question was more that, just to add to you too, that the question was more that if there are countries who is already foreseeing how could that be solved, that other countries are able to pick that best practice up in this best practice learning network.
So good. We have one question that came in through Slido, which is, are we moving beyond use of real world data in outcome-based agreements to treatment optimization?
What a great question to finish. Anyone?
So the question is, are we moving beyond use of real world data in outcomes-based agreements to treatment optimization?
That would be great. I mean, in sense, it's from a gut feeling perspective. If you look at the disease that we represent, those very few ones that do have treatment, and even those ones that do have several treatments, and they are not only symptomatic but transformative, there still is a space for defining what the the appropriate use of a therapy in the cycle of or in the disease progression should be. And this, can only be achieved with not clinical trials based data, but on routine use of those therapies and what their place is. But of course, first for us, for the majority of the rare diseases, we need to have a treatment to be able to. But effectively, I think with the sharing of data, in a number of cases, rare diseases are also treated off-label or are treated differently. There might be other type of intervention that are used that are not necessarily pharmacological. And therefore, understanding how this has been done and grouping those grouping this knowledge is of fundamental importance to understand how we can treat the disease, care for it, and develop treatment.
Thank you. I was thinking this quite recent article from Hans Georg Eichler that was titled something like Precision Reimbursement, and he and his colleagues defined 3 models, from which 2 were like the current pay and follow-up model, where all these risk sharing agreements and so on were included, and then the sort of future model was called learn, predict, and adapt, I think. So yeah. And Carlos.
Yeah, I would like to add something to what Pia said. We are now dealing with data from CAR-Ts and trying to adapt the treatment to the patient and try to optimize the treatment. And one of the things we have done with the academic CAR-Ts is, instead of doing 1 infusion, into 2 infusions, just to reduce the toxicity. So this is based on real world evidence. I mean, we have been working on that, and also we are now trying to work in a predictive model, trying to link some characteristic of the patient, number of lines previous to the CAR-T, time from diagnosis and things like that, trying to adapt and find which patients could be much more will take much more advantage for the CAR-Ts. There's something like a reimbursement adaptative or based in optimization.
Great, sounds good. Laura, I think it's now time that I'll hand over to you and to bridge sort of the feedback from these panels with the topic of the whole panel. So the question was, where does real-world evidence for decisions go from here?
Thank you very much, Pia. So yes, so we're sort of coming to the end of this year's programme, and thank you very much. I'd like to thank everyone on behalf of the Secretariat as well for all the contributions, because it wouldn't happen without you. So we now need to think about what the agenda looks like for next year. I have to say all the input we've heard in the discussions this morning have been incredibly informative, but I'd like to take this opportunity to ask the panel here and also open up to the floor, both in person and virtually. What would be your 1 key priority, if you could just name 1, and we'll work on that and we'll compile it together for the real world evidence for decision agenda for next year. So to remind you, this is obviously a multi-stakeholder learning network. That's our objective, and welcome your input and your feedback. So Simone, can I start with you?
Let's see if I put my thoughts in order in time. So 1 thought. Oh dear. Key priority is to look very intensively on how patient co-creation of evidence generation plan can actually take place in terms of modeling, or at least experiencing how the early involvement of patients in the evidence generation planning on what needs to be addressed, what can and cannot be collected, what can and how to collect it to have good quality data should be. I have other ideas too, but I'm stop here.
I think one of my key objectives would be to translate in practice what we have learned until now.
Thank you. So through sort of demonstration projects. Yeah. Thank you.
2. Staying true to our learning by doing learning network approach, I think having a broader repository of pay for performance models and learn from those. And I think zooming there in on what are kind of, because we often hear it's very complex, a lot of barriers to put this together, but what are ways, simple, effective ways of how we can make this work? Because it is the future direction if we want to come to a value-based healthcare model.
Thank you very much.
Well, I could say the aforementioned very early dialogue, very early engagement between stakeholders with the idea of make a good evidence generation plan, including real-world evidence, but for the full cycle of the draft, not be so reactive. So trying to work from the very early stage.
Thank you. And with that, thank you very much. I'd like to open up the floor also to the wider audience. Marine, maybe if there are any questions, you can take them on. Any comments?
Yeah. People want to raise their hands. They have a question. Stefan.
I'd like to add to that these early involvement of all stakeholders will result in building that trust. And I think it's one of the key elements that is still missing today. We should be aware that there are 3 stakeholders around the table, and that's the government or the authorities, European, either national, the patients and the industry clinicians, and so on. And there's still not 100% mutual trust.
I think it could also be interesting if we could focus very much on trust and simplicity. I like Toon's focus on simplicity, so we don't develop a new dragon. There's so many possibilities in real world evidence, and we can just add on all the time. So how can we, with real examples, show that this is possible to do in a trusted way and in as simple as possible way?
Any other questions?
Just a small comment that I tried, very interesting on discussions that we had in the third group. This evidence generations plan need incorporations of this strategy in the European HTA regulations. And given that there we have to do some priority on orphans, ATMP, or by the way, innovative drugs, we need to have well-structured indications at European level. So this, I think, it's still a gap in the HTA regulations. So we have to push on this to have more indications, a sort of harmonizations for all the member states, to accept which could be this evidence generations plan in terms of criteria, so eligibility, and I'm not referring only on regulatory side, that maybe this is more acceptable because the discussions, thanks of the early dialogue, scientific advice, but I'm pushing this interactions more versus the payer perspective, that it's the harder, extreme, I think, side of these interactions, because when we talk about outcome-based agreement, yet it's a value for money, so it's a value-based pricing. So we have to touch the elephant in the room, that is the price. But starting to be pragmatic, this evidence generation plan, if this is well accepted from all the member states, from a clinical perspective, regulatory perspective, HTA perspective, I'm including here also patients, because HTA, it's a multidisciplinary perspective. I think that could be a very good step to move in advance and to create this real world evidence generations accepted from all the member states and all the stakeholders.
Yeah, I just wanted to say what's been said by some people before. It's not just about being reactive and creating real world evidence as outcome and performance, but we need to use the possibilities to assemble the natural history of diseases. We need natural history data in order to know what we're actually working on. And so coming from the rare disease patient perspective, I think it's really important to get more natural history data and be able to include them for the decision-making process as well.
Thank you very much. I think unless there are any other comments, I'll make an attempt at a summary. So we'll be putting our thinking caps on and come back and obviously consult with you, but maybe to feedback what I've just heard, and also within the context of the framework of real world evidence for decisions, which obviously, and this meeting is very much focused about policies and partnership. So I think we hear very clearly, obviously there's a lot going on in terms of policies. We've got the EU HTA regulation, we've got the European Health Data Space. I hear this call for, we see fragmentation, and that's a challenge. So there's still quite a need for us also as a group to advocate in terms of those sort of legislative initiatives which frame enactment around data. And I think also we've heard very clearly, let's remember what drives this. It's ultimately about improving the quality of life of patients. And we always have to remember, why are we doing all this? This is the key driver. Then in terms of partnerships, I think the point which is we're always very mindful of what's the driver here. We have to build a trust, because without the trust, we can't really make progress. And here also being proactive together. I think that's quite clear. And then actually how with the patient at the center and there as well in terms of the development of the evidence generation plans. So I think this is very clear in our work around partnerships, how we will work on that. Then in terms of new activities as well, I think we hear a lot about the life cycle. That's something we've talked about, but obviously we have Darwin, the role of the regulators and how that correlates with the HTA payer community. And I certainly heard in the group that I was in, and maybe more broadly as well, how the HTA community and how the payer community work themselves to be able to pose questions to the regulators. So these are all maybe structures that need to be developed, payer networks as well as HTA networks. Then in terms of transparency, which is a key pillar for real world evidence for decisions, I think we've heard very clearly the need to share the outcomes of outcomes-based managed entry agreements. And we'll think about how we can perhaps as a group foster that. Very mindful that quality of data is incredibly important. And that really comes to the pillar of what we do by learning by doing. And then to build on what Toon said around collaboration, keeping it simple, but actually getting demonstration projects. I think that's a very clear call. Obviously, we've in the past discussed this. Obviously, there are also networks like the Beneluxa in Finos. Maybe those could be fora for these products. And certainly real world evidence for decisions will look to collaborate with all different entities who are active in this topic around the use of real world evidence. So with that, I'd like to thank Pia for chairing and the panel and for all your contributions on behalf of the Real World Evidence Secretariat. And I'd like to hand over to you, Joe, for concluding remarks.
Okay. Thanks a lot. This symposium comes to an end. I think we have gathered a lot of information. We have heard very interesting keynote speeches, one at distance, one in real life. And we have picked up a lot of inspiring ideas during the panels. Thanks to all the speakers, participants, and the panelists. I think some conclusions are obvious. First of all, we cannot deny that there is a growing interest with regard to the use of real-world evidence in the different stages of decision-making with regard especially to new therapies. Good scientific progress has been made, but nevertheless, there are still a lot of efforts to make to find appropriate answers and solutions responding to the existing challenges and barriers with regard to the implementation of real-world evidence in payers' decision. I had tried also to make some summary and noticed some key messages or key thoughts we have already heard. First thing is we can do more. We should do more. We should increase our efforts in different ways, especially, as was said in the last panel, also building trust. I come back on that. Secondly, I think we are not well prepared. We can be prepared better, and we should invest in that to do so. We are working at a learning and participating in a learning health system, which need clear synergies together with other partners. This real-world evidence is more than a technical issue. We have talked about education of patients, co-creation with patients, involvement also of clinicians. It's more than a technical issue. It's not a standalone issue neither. It's a part of a broader system change, if I allow me to use some great words. We have to clarify, and we have tried to clarify the role also of real-world evidence. It's a complementary tool. It's not substantiating others, but it's adding new value to what we try to have. It's more evidence about clinical benefits and the value for patients. Real-world evidence is not something which we should use everywhere, not in every case. It's we should focus on that, and rare diseases was mentioned, and Matti mentioned also problem of elderly people, and I think we can stress that also at the end of this discussion. I think that's very clear that on this way we have to make prioritizations also when we will use real-world evidence. There are opportunities. We have we know that the HTA directive is upcoming, but we have seen also that there is no specific role and no specific focus on real-world evidence. Nevertheless, as Claudia has mentioned, there is the possibility of voluntary collaboration, and let's try to concretize that. Nevertheless, it was said, okay, we should have these contacts with HTA bodies. I come later back on that. Emma, we have seen, I think, a proactive approach in data sharing, data perception, data collection better. Someone said we have to test Darwin now. Okay, I think it's clear. There's also the need to have as soon as possible contacts in order to make data sets clear for development. This is not an isolated issue, I have already said. We have also talking about the pay for performance contracts, which seems to be more and more complex. Nevertheless, for some of them, of course, real world evidence will be at stake, and we should have the right and robust and consistent methodologies on board. A lot of things has been said about the process of decision making. Sequential for the moment, but should be more circular in the future. Early dialogues with an implication of a lot of partners. We know all the partners which have a role to play. A process also with regard to evidence generation plans. What do we mean by that? What is it concrete? Is this something which is compulsory? What will be the impacts? How do we deal with real-world evidence during the life cycle of a product? As early as possible, but what do we do after every answers when we see things which should be corrected? It's a continuous endeavor and a continuous approach which is needed. And last but not least, of course, there's a data strategy which is behind this. The data are a tool, but I think it's clear that it's more than registries. It should be an integrated approach in which different data was also a reference to pharmacovigilance. It should be also not used separately, but more conceived as a one-stop shop, or as something which is consistent over different countries and member states. There's a question of governance of this data. It was clearly mentioned. And of course, the question of funding arises also. That are some takeaways of what we heard, but for us, of course, it's important to see what can we do as real-world evidence for decisions. I think we are willing, and your participations here in person and at a distance proves clearly that there's a willingness to continue. And it should be interesting that we could contribute our available expertise and support together with other initiatives that was also mentioned, coordination with other initiatives. And based on our discussions, I think there are different work streams we could identify and should clarify in the upcoming period, which are also based on the principles which are underpinning our network. It's collaboration and transparency. I think first thing is to strengthen our contacts with the payer community. There are a lot of networks. We see there is a reluctance, and for reasons which are understandable, we should to invest in trust and also know which are the reasons behind eventual barriers or reluctance. It's of great importance to clarify the main concerns of the payers and their needs in order to define concrete pathways which can bring further on and which could contribute to find actionable and practical solutions with regard to the best possible evaluation of therapeutic value. I think that's very clear. Second element is related to transparency, is sharing of information. And I think what's clearly come out of our discussions is to have also close contacts with EMA, which these contacts already exist, but also with the head of agencies group of HTA bodies to see, okay, can we build together on concrete development plans in order to make progress in the future? And why not think to, for instance, on a portal in which study designs, real-world data protocols, guidelines are shared together and made publicly accessible. I think that can also be of a great help. And finally, I think the word managed entry agreement was frequently mentioned. With the growing number of ATMPs which are coming up, payers will face pressures in the near future to find also the effective strategies to mitigate affordability challenges. And it's necessary to see under which conditions this outcome-based managed entry agreements together, of course, not forget the change in the process as a whole, but in the meantime, what can we do with this affordability challenges related to outcomes-based managed entry agreement? Could we find sustainable solutions to find answers and to respond on the expectations of the different stakeholders? It seems for me useful and necessary to reflect on practical frameworks and also sharing the best practices with regard to their implementations and follow-up. And I think we will discuss all this material in our steering committee and how to and when to set further concrete steps and actions. Thank you for all your ideas. I think they are very fruitful for our further reflection. And of course, we will keep you informed. And to conclude, once again, thanks for everybody to participating and attending this symposium. Thanks again for the speakers and the panelists, also the Secretariat for an enormous support. Good health also for Karen Facey, who could not attend, but who is in fact one of our scientific mainstays of the network. I think with enthusiasm and commitment we have seen today, I'm sure that this network can contribute to further unleash the potential of real-world evidence for decision-making and also fostering access for patients who are confronted with unmet needs. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Jo. So indeed, a lot of food for thought, and we look forward to implementing all those ideas together with you, Jo, our steering group members, in the next years. So I think it just is left to thank you all, online attendees and in person. A special thank you to Matti and Pia for helping us co-moderate the panels, and to Karen, who's been instrumental in all the work and is listening to us online. So yes, thank you very much all. For those here in person, lunch will be served in the room next door. And yes, please check out the website for the recording and an event report, which will be published very soon, as well as information about the activities for next year's. Thank you very much and have a nice day.